Hi, everyone. We're here with lesson 3 on the story of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. With this story, we're going to look at what it teaches us about the ways in which both Black and white folks in the agricultural field in particular were impacted by systemic oppression. And we'll look at the ways in which Black and white communities tried to build solidarity and work together to win liberation and improvements in their lives. Uh, the story of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union is going to continue the pattern of labor organizing that we began in lesson 2 with the story of the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters. Again, right, the story of labor organizing is an important precursor to the civil rights movement and demonstrates the central role that economic freedom as a demand played in the story. So the Southern Tenant Farmers Union was a union of sharecroppers and tenant farmers, interracial union founded in 1934 in the middle of the Great Depression in Arkansas. It does serve as a case study in organizing across racial differences, not necessarily a fully successful story or a full failure. You'll at the end of this lesson, you'll make the judgment call about the extent to which they were successful in organizing across racial differences. Important historical context is understanding the Great Depression and the New Deal for sharecroppers and tenant farmers. So first, let's remind ourselves, sharecroppers and tenant farmers, who are they? Sharecropping was a system where large landowners would essentially allow poor farmers, to use some of their land to grow crops in exchange for a share of those crops. Because sharecroppers did not have a lot of cash on hand to buy their own tools, pay for their own medical care, landowners would often keep them in debt by charging high prices for tools and medical care. So sharecropping, it was a cycle of debt. It was very hard to get out of. It was a means of survival after slavery. But actually, not just for Black folks, right? There were white and Black sharecroppers. Tenant farming is a system at the same time where it was slightly more financially secure farmers, although they were poor as well, but more than sharecroppers, were able to use some of the cash they had to rent a share of the land, and they typically had their own team and tools as well. When the Great Depression hit in the early 1930s, Black folks' rate of unemployment was double that of whites. So they were hit particularly hard during this time period. Although it is important to say, right, like everyone was hit hard. The unemployment rate was near 30% during at the height of the Great Depression. There were, so the New Deal was something that Franklin Delano Roosevelt put in place to expand the power of the federal government in order to provide social safety net for folks and to hire people and get people working again to try and jumpstart the economy. So, they hired many people in these like federal works programs. Actually, Central High School was built by a federal works program during the Great Depression, people hired by the federal government to do construction works. One thing that the New Deal did for agricultural workers was pass something known as the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which paid land-owning farmers to take some of their land out of use in order to increase crop prices, supply and demand, right? So decrease the supply in order to bring the prices back up. They were not supposed to evict sharecroppers and tenant farmers, kick them off the land, but they did. And in 1933 to 34, nearly 900,000 white and Black sharecroppers and tenant farmers were evicted from the land. So you end up with this, homelessness crisis for farming families. In response, they formed the Southern Tenant Farmers Union in Arkansas in 1934. At the height of the union, it had about 30,000 members, right? So not the majority of sharecroppers and tenant farmers. 80% of the union was Black and 20% was white. It's important to recognize that while Black and white sharecroppers and tenant farmers have similar economic conditions, they have different social conditions. So Segregated schooling meant unequal, under-resourced schooling for Black communities. Black students attended school less often than white students who were able to attend all year because Black students were expected to work on the farms. Travel was not safe in the during the time period where there were a lot of Klan members and hostile white counties for Black folks traveling. And there was a history of racialized attacks on Black farmers who tried to organize prior to this time period, which we'll look at in a couple slides. Just a little bit more about the role of race in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, in particular with the 1935 Social Security Act. Before this, it is important to say, right, that Black communities benefited from certain aspects of the New Deal. They were hired by the federal works programs, things like that. There were aspects that they disproportionately were excluded from, but not because of race explicitly. So, for example, the 1935 Social Security Act excluded agricultural and domestic workers from old age insurance, meaning payments that folks would get, which we rely on today. Once someone retires, when they're older, they would get a Social Security payment each month. And people who became unemployed and were trying to find work but were unable to would get unemployment benefits, which many folks are relying on now, especially in the midst of this pandemic where there's millions of people filing for unemployment. This all started during the Great Depression and with the New Deal programs. Now, because agricultural and domestic workers were excluded from these two benefits of the act, it excluded both white and Black and other people of other races from these works. So it wasn't a race explicit exclusion. Right, Black workers in other fields were included. However, because Black workers, 65% of all Black workers were working in agriculture or domestic service. 65% of Black workers were excluded from old age insurance and unemployment insurance, whereas 27% of white workers were excluded because only 27% of white workers worked in agriculture and domestic service. So it impacted a lot of people. And if you read the link I attached here, you can find out a lot more about some of the details of the bureaucratic mess in deciding whether to include agricultural or domestic workers. There has been historical debate about, why they excluded them. I'll leave you for those interested to explore that. But the point is that even without racialized intent, the impact was harmful for many Black communities. However, they were included in 1954 with old age insurance and 1976 with unemployment insurance. I wanted to go back to that point about racialized attacks on Black farmers. An example of that is the Elaine Massacre, which was a situation in 1919 during the Red Summer, where Black sharecroppers, including one white lawyer who they invited, were at a church to try and organize and address the issue of oppressive landowners. Local white men didn't like that they were organizing, fired shots into the church. The shots were returned. One white person was killed. The governor called in 500 soldiers because he heard of these rumors of a Black rebellion. In fact, they were just defending themselves and were not about to rebel. Nevertheless, the soldiers, along with local vigilantes, killed at least 200 Black folks at this time. Because this white person was killed, 12 Black men were convicted for murder, and nobody was tried or convicted or sentenced for the murder of those 200 Black folks. The NAACP sued on behalf of these men, and they were able to win their case in the case Moore v. Dempsey, and the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment, passed during radical Reconstruction, was violated. Their due process rights were violated because of the jury was all white. They didn't get an opportunity to testify. Their confessions were had under torture, and there was mob violence that pressured the jury to convict them. So they were eventually released. But this is important because it lets us know that in the 1930s, when the Southern Tenant Farmers Union is organizing, a lot of Black folks might be hesitant to join because they know that it could risk their lives because of previous incidents like this where Black farmers organizing would have been attacked. Because I mentioned the NAACP here, I wanted to remind you who that group was, founded by Ida B. Wells, W.E.B. Du Bois, and several white supporters as an interracial group in 1909 to fight against segregation and disenfranchisement. They ran an anti-lynching campaign. They fought in the courts. They ran voter registration drives. And so, just important to remember who they were. Tenant farmers, sharecroppers, in organizing for change, they had the initial goal to stop evictions, but they had a larger vision. They disagreed, though. Some of the more socialist leaders in the union wanted communal land, mutual aid in village farm economies, while many wanted to end the exploitation of white-owned plantation system. That's they all agreed on, but some folks preferred private land holdings, not communal land. So there were differences, different ideologies within the union. Some of their methods, they lobbied Congress to expand Social Security. They held mass gatherings in Baptist churches with revivalist songs and speeches. This becomes an important way in which people gather during the Civil Rights Movement. And they do some other acts like these encampments, such as the one in Missouri in 1939, where evicted farmers gathered and camped out on Highway 61 to get news attention. The governor ordered them to disperse, and many ended up starving and very sick, and some died because they, were homeless and didn't have a means during this time period. There is a decline in the Union for a variety of reasons. World War II distracts everyone's attention from domestic stuff to the war. There were internal disagreements, some of which were dealing with race, ideology. There was outside repression, attacks on the Union, and there was increase in mechanization, which decreased the need for sharecropping. So at this point, I want you to engage in this inquiry. I linked the sources here. If you're on your PhilSD account, you can open it directly from the slides, but you can also just find it on the Brotherhood and Southern Tenant Farmers Union homework post, where I added it to that post. And I want you to consider the extent to which Southern Tenant Farmers Union built unbreakable racial solidarity among sharecroppers and tenant farmers. There's a variety of sources that I made available to you. And if you went to open up that source, you'll see the sources I made available. If you did this in the breakout room session during the virtual class, you don't need to do this now. But there's a set of 3 sources, primary sources from a book, and I included those. And there's a set of secondary sources from a dissertation. You get a range of experiences. You have to infer. Pay attention to, as you read through, pay attention to the successes that Black organizers and white organizers had in working together, the need to work together, but also pay attention to the challenges they had. Source F is particularly useful for that in helping us understand whether white farmers, Black farmers how did they respond to organizers. And you'll notice in source F that a lot of white farmers actually did not like a Black organizer organizing them. They've requested white organizers. So, how much solidarity was actually built? Of course, it's a complicated story, and I want you to pay attention to that. But it's important to recognize that this union is an example of the effort to build racial solidarity. And I can't emphasize that enough. I think sometimes we tell a story of, just racial strife all the time. And while there are tremendous challenges within the union due to continued existence of racism, there were efforts to build that solidarity. And that is something that is really important in understanding the history of interracial organizing. So the Southern Tenant Farmers Union provides a really incredible history of labor organizing in the agricultural field in the South, and gives us a sense of how folks were resisting prior to the Civil Rights Movement. So we'll get started with the Civil Rights Movement in the next video, lesson 4, so you can check that out. Take care, continue to take care of yourselves during this pandemic crisis, and hope to see you in the virtual classes.